My name is Ethan. I'm 37 years old, and I work as a sales representative for an industrial equipment company. I live in Springfield, Missouri, and I spend a good part of my week driving between small towns to visit clients. Anyone who does this kind of work knows that sometimes the day starts before sunrise and doesn't end until long after dark. This happened in late October 2023, after a meeting that lasted much longer than expected at a company near Rolla. By the time I finally got into my car to head home, it was already past 8 at night. I was tired, hungry, and all I wanted was to get home before midnight. The temperature had dropped considerably since late afternoon. My windows fogged up easily, and I kept the heater on its lowest setting just to stay comfortable. Traffic on the highway was moving slowly because of road construction that had been showing up on navigation apps for several days. My GPS suggested an alternate route along a rural road and estimated it would save me nearly half an hour. At that moment, it seemed like the obvious choice. At first, there was nothing unusual about the road. It was narrow with only one lane in each direction, no streetlights, and surrounded by farms and stretches of forest. Every so often, I would pass an isolated mailbox or a dirt driveway leading to some property hidden in the darkness. After a few miles, even those landmarks disappeared. It had been quite a while since I had passed another vehicle. The only sounds inside the car were the engine, the steady hum of the tires rolling over the uneven pavement, and the air blowing through the dashboard vents. My cell signal started cutting in and out, and the music I was listening to stopped loading. I didn't think much of it because that happened all the time in that part of the state. Even so, I found myself looking at the GPS more often than at the clock. The road felt far too long for a simple detour. Still, I kept driving because turning around didn't make sense after coming that far. After a few more minutes, I noticed that the app wasn't showing any nearby towns, gas stations, or major intersections. It was just a thin line crossing a completely dark section of the map. I thought it was strange, but I assumed it was simply a more remote area. I slowed down a little because there were a lot of curves, and in some places the tree canopy almost completely covered the road. My headlights only illuminated a few yards ahead, and beyond that it was impossible to see anything. The pavement had also gotten much worse. There were patched sections, small cracks, and dry leaves scattered across the surface. I remember thinking the road probably didn't receive much maintenance. A few minutes later, the GPS instructed me to continue straight for another 300 yards. Then, without any warning about a dead end or a turnaround, the road simply ended. The pavement stopped at a small dirt clearing surrounded by tall trees on 3 sides. There were no signs indicating it was a dead-end road. There wasn't even enough space to keep driving forward. Just that empty patch of ground surrounded by forest. I sat there for a few seconds trying to understand what had happened. I looked back at the GPS and it was still telling me to continue straight as if the road still existed. I even tried refreshing the route, but the signal was so weak that the app barely responded. I sighed, shifted into reverse, and slowly began turning the car around so I could head back the way I had come. That was the exact moment I saw a pair of headlights appear on the road I had just driven in on. At first, I assumed it was another lost driver, maybe someone else following the GPS. But instead of continuing normally, the sedan slowed down until it nearly stopped at the entrance to the clearing. It came to a halt, partially blocking the road, its headlights pointed directly at my car. I stayed still for a few seconds, expecting it to continue. Instead, the engine shut off. The driver's door slowly opened, and a man stepped out without any sense of urgency. He closed the door, slipped his hands into the pockets of his jacket, and stood completely still, staring directly at me. Even from that distance, I could tell he wasn't waving for help. He wasn't saying a word, and he didn't seem interested in approaching. He simply stood there watching me. At that moment, I tried to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe he lived nearby and was curious about who had ended up there. Maybe he was lost too. Even so, something about the situation felt wrong. The man wasn't looking around, checking a phone, or showing any sign of uncertainty. All of his attention was focused on me. I grabbed my phone to reopen the map, but the screen displayed no service. I looked up for just a second and saw that he hadn't moved an inch. I decided not to get out of the car. I locked the doors instinctively and shifted into drive to finish turning around and head back toward the road. Before I could line the car up with the exit, another set of headlights appeared behind the sedan. This time it was a large, dark pickup truck that slowly entered the narrow road. It rolled forward until it stopped directly behind the first vehicle, completely blocking the remaining space. The gap between the two vehicles was far too small for anything to squeeze through. Once the truck turned off its high beams, I could clearly see that it had been positioned deliberately to seal off the only way out. My heart started racing instantly. I don't remember ever feeling such a powerful surge of adrenaline. My hands began sweating on the steering wheel as I kept looking back and forth between the man standing there and the pickup truck. A few seconds later, the passenger door of the truck opened. Another man stepped out, then a third one. None of them said a single word. They didn't walk toward me either. They simply stayed near the truck, staring at my car as if they were waiting for me to react. That was when I stopped searching for an innocent explanation. This didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. I had been the only vehicle on that road for a long time, and they had just blocked the only possible exit. I remember feeling such an intense knot in my stomach that I almost became nauseous. I turned off my phone screen to avoid any light inside the car and began scanning the clearing for another way out. There were only dense trees, muddy embankments, and thick branches. If I tried driving through the woods in a sedan, I'd probably get stuck or destroy the suspension before making it 60 feet. At that moment, I realized I was completely trapped. I sat perfectly still for several seconds, trying to think clearly. My first instinct was to call 911, but my phone still displayed no service. I held it up near the windshield, then close to the side window as if a few inches might somehow make a difference. Nothing. I looked back at the men. The first one was still standing exactly where he had gotten out of the sedan. The other two were beside the pickup truck, quietly talking to each other. I couldn't make out any words, only a muffled murmur that disappeared into the silence of the woods. My engine was still running and the temperature gauge remained normal. The only sounds inside the car were the heater fan and my own breathing, which was much faster than I realized. Then one of the men subtly pointed toward my car. The others looked at me at the same time. None of them smiled, gestured, or appeared nervous. Their calmness frightened me more than any threat could have. Without thinking much about it, I turned off my headlights. The clearing became almost completely dark. Only the faint moonlight filtered through gaps in the trees, and the pickup's dark headlights reflected faintly off the damp ground. I figured that without the direct light, they might have a harder time following my movements inside the car. I kept watching through the mirrors. After about a minute, the man who had been standing there from the beginning finally started walking. He wasn't running or showing any urgency. He moved slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on my windshield. Every step seemed deliberate. When he got within a few yards of the hood, he could finally see my face more clearly. That was when I heard a sound coming from the woods to my right. It sounded like a thick branch snapping under someone's weight. I glanced in that direction, and for just a moment, I thought I saw another person moving between the trees. I couldn't be certain because it was too dark, but that alone was enough to make me realize that maybe those three men weren't the only people involved. At that moment, I stopped thinking about the car and started thinking about getting out alive. I was driving a front-wheel drive sedan, but I remembered noticing when I first entered the clearing that the vegetation looked thinner on the left side. It wasn't a road, just a strip of ground with short grass and a few smaller trees. If it didn't work, I'd probably destroy the front end of my car. If it did, maybe I could reach another property or another road. I kept my foot on the brake and waited for the man to take a few more steps closer. When he got close enough that my parking lights partially illuminated his face, I saw that he wasn't carrying a flashlight and wasn't signaling for me to roll down the window. He just kept walking in silence. I took a deep breath, turned the steering wheel all the way to the left, and slammed my foot down on the accelerator. The tires spun for a brief moment on the loose dirt before finding traction. The car bounced over a low embankment and plunged into the vegetation. Branches slammed violently against the doors and windshield. I heard a loud crack beneath the car, followed by the scraping sound of something dragging across the undercarriage. But I kept accelerating without looking back. It couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 seconds crossing that terrain, but it felt like several minutes. The car bounced so violently that I thought it was going to roll over. At one point, I drove over a small fallen tree and nearly lost control. When I finally emerged from the woods, I found a gravel road running parallel to the forest. I had no idea where I was, but the fact that there was a road was enough. I looked in the rearview mirror and could only see the treetops swaying. There were no headlights following me. Even so, I kept accelerating without slowing down. After a few miles, my cell signal suddenly came back. The very first thing I did was call 911 while I was still driving. I explained my approximate location, told them I believed I had been surrounded by several men, and gave them everything I could remember about the two vehicles. The dispatcher instructed me not to return to the area and told me to continue to the nearest gas station, where a patrol unit would meet me. It wasn't until I stopped at that station nearly half an hour later that I realized my hands were still shaking so badly I could barely hold a cup of coffee. The officers arrived shortly afterward and listened carefully to everything I told them. One of them took notes while the other asked very specific questions about the location, the direction I had entered from, the approximate time, and the descriptions of the vehicles. I drove back with them to an area nearby, but it was already late at night and I couldn't identify exactly which road I had taken. There were too many similar rural roads with no visible signs and surrounded by woods. At one point, one of the officers mentioned that some old roads in that region weren't properly updated in navigation apps, causing people to end up on them by mistake. When I mentioned that the men had simply watched me and blocked the exit without saying a single word, the two officers exchanged a quick glance. Nobody confirmed that anything like that had happened before, but nobody treated my story as an exaggeration either. They filed the report, recommended that I save the approximate location from my GPS history, and said they would search the area that very night. I never found out whether they located those vehicles or uncovered any other evidence. That happened nearly 3 years ago, and ever since then I've completely changed the way I travel for work. I never accept alternate routes along unfamiliar roads anymore, especially at night. I also keep offline maps downloaded and a portable charger in my car at all times, because I realized how dependent I had been on my phone that night. Sometimes I still think about what might have happened if I had turned off the engine to talk to that man, or gotten out of the car to figure out what was going on. Maybe it would have been nothing. Maybe there was an explanation I'll never know. But the image that keeps coming back to me is those 3 men standing completely still, silently staring at me, while the pickup truck blocked the only way out of that road. There was never a threat, I never heard a single word, and nobody ever touched my car. Even so, it was the most terrifying situation I've ever experienced, precisely because everything pointed to the fact that I had driven into a trap long before I realized there was no longer any way out. Story 2. My name is Megan. I'm 34 years old and I work as a real estate agent in southwestern Virginia. Besides showing homes to clients, I'm often responsible for visiting vacant properties, making sure everything is in order, and photographing them for listings. Since much of my work takes place in small towns, I've grown used to driving along rural roads and visiting completely isolated properties. What I'm about to tell you happened in early spring of 2024 and was, without a doubt, the most terrifying experience I've ever had on the job. That week, an old house had just been put on the market after sitting vacant for many years. The owner lived in another state and asked me to go there to take the first set of photos before showings began. The address was near a small community between Christiansburg and Blacksburg, but the property itself was much farther out, at the end of a narrow road surrounded by forest. I assumed it would be just another quick visit like so many others I'd done before. I arrived shortly after 3 in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, but there was still plenty of daylight. The road was short and ended right at the entrance to that house. There were no other homes beyond it, only tall trees and dense woods stretching in every direction. There were a few houses farther back along the road, but they were spread far apart. I parked my SUV in front of the garage, grabbed my camera, my phone, and the folder with the property documents. Before going inside, I walked around the property to photograph the front, the backyard, and the exterior. The place was unusually quiet. There were no lawnmowers, barking dogs, children playing, or passing cars. Just the wind moving the branches and the constant sound of birds hidden in the woods. The house looked like it had been empty for a long time. The windows were clean, but I could immediately smell that familiar scent of a house that's been closed up for months when I unlocked the front door using the lockbox beside the entrance. My plan was to finish everything in less than an hour and head to another appointment scheduled for later that afternoon. I spent about 40 minutes photographing every room. It was a 2-story house with old hardwood floors that creaked in certain places, but it was in good condition overall. I took pictures of the kitchen, bedrooms, bathrooms, and back porch, while making notes about minor repairs the owner should complete before showing it to buyers. As I worked, the silence kept drawing my attention. In empty houses, it's normal to hear wood expanding, the ventilation system making occasional noises, or even small animals moving around on the roof. There was almost none of that. Several times I stopped taking pictures just to listen, because the silence was so complete that it felt unnatural. When I finished photographing the last upstairs bedroom, I walked over to a window facing the road just to check whether there was still enough light to photograph the front of the house again. That's when I saw a man slowly walking toward the property. He was still far away, coming from the beginning of the road, maintaining a steady pace without looking from side to side. At first I didn't think much of it, but after only a few seconds I realized something obvious. The road ended exactly where I was standing. There were no stores, trails, parks, or any other houses beyond that property. I kept watching through the window for a few more moments, trying to come up with a logical explanation. I thought maybe he lived in one of the houses farther back and was simply out for a walk. But the closer he got, the less that explanation made sense. He wasn't wearing running clothes, wasn't carrying a backpack, a phone, or shopping bags, and he was walking far too slowly for someone exercising. What bothered me the most was that his face remained pointed directly at the house the entire time. I decided not to wait to find out why. I packed away my camera, closed all the windows I had opened to brighten the rooms, and locked the front door. As I walked toward my SUV, I looked back down the road. The man was much closer now, maybe less than 100 yards away. He still showed no sense of urgency and made no gesture when he noticed me watching him. I quickly got into my SUV, started the engine, and fastened my seatbelt. That's when I looked toward the end of the road and felt my stomach drop. An old, rusted truck was parked sideways across almost the entire width of the road. I was absolutely certain the truck hadn't been there when I arrived. I stared at the truck for several seconds, unable to understand what I was seeing. It was an old work truck with a weathered wooden flatbed. The engine was off, and there was nobody inside the cab. Its position made no sense either. It wasn't parked along the shoulder or pulled into a driveway. It was literally sitting sideways across the road, blocking almost the entire passage. There was still a narrow gap between the rear of the truck and a drainage ditch, but it was far too small for my SUV to squeeze through without hitting something. My first thought was that a local resident had broken down. I grabbed my phone to call the real estate office and let them know I might be delayed, but once again the signal kept cutting in and out. The call never even connected. I looked up, searching for the man who had been walking down the road. He was still approaching, much closer now, but still completely silent. He didn't seem to care at all that the truck was blocking the road. He simply kept walking toward the house. I decided I wasn't going to sit there waiting. I shifted into reverse to give myself room in case I needed to maneuver quickly, and started looking for a way around the truck by driving across the grass. That's when I heard a sound coming from inside the house. It wasn't loud, but it was very different from the natural creaks of old wood. It sounded like a door upstairs being carefully closed. Instinctively, I looked in the rearview mirror, which reflected part of the front of the house. Every door was still closed exactly as I had left it. I thought maybe I'd forgotten to shut a window and the wind had slammed it. While I was still trying to rationalize it, another movement caught my attention. Through the living room window facing the front yard, I saw something move quickly behind the thin curtain. I couldn't make out a face or clothing. It was just a shadow crossing the room from one side to the other. My entire body froze. I had personally checked every room in that house and knew there hadn't been anyone inside when I left. Even so, at that moment, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was no longer the only person on that property. My first reaction was to convince myself I was interpreting everything incorrectly. Maybe it was just the reflection of a tree branch moving across the window. Maybe the curtain had shifted in the breeze. But while I continued staring at the house, the living room curtain moved again, this time slowly, as if someone were pulling it aside just a few inches to look outside. I couldn't see a face, only the fabric moving and a dark space appearing behind it before the curtain returned to its original position. At that exact moment, I heard another sound coming from inside the house. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, heavy, evenly spaced footsteps, exactly like someone walking across the hardwood floor in the upstairs hallway. The sound carried easily through the silence of the road. I looked back at the man who was still walking toward me and realized he had slowed down even more. He was now close enough for me to clearly see what he was wearing: an old brown jacket, faded blue jeans, and a dark baseball cap. He still wasn't looking anywhere except at the house and my SUV. He didn't raise a hand, didn't speak, and showed no expression from that distance. It gave me the unsettling feeling that he knew exactly where I was. That was when I stopped trying to understand what was happening and focused only on getting out of there. I shifted the SUV into drive and slowly moved toward the truck to get a better look at the narrow gap between the flatbed and the drainage ditch. It was incredibly tight. If I misjudged it by only a few inches, one of my wheels could slip into the ditch and leave me completely stuck. As I calculated the distance, I heard a metallic sound behind me. I immediately looked in the rearview mirror and saw the front door handle of the house slowly move. The door opened only a few inches and stayed that way without anyone stepping outside. My chest felt so tight that I could barely breathe. Without wasting another second, I turned the steering wheel all the way, hit the accelerator, and aimed for the only opening beside the truck. My right side mirror scraped violently against the wooden flatbed with a loud crack. I thought I had ripped the door off the SUV, but I kept accelerating. The vehicle leaned as the front wheel nearly dropped into the ditch, then climbed back onto the pavement and finally squeezed through. The instant I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing in the middle of the road watching my SUV drive away, while the front door of the house remained open exactly as it had been. I didn't slow down until I reached a state highway a few minutes later. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to stop at the first gas station I found. I parked near the convenience store where there were other people around, and only then was I finally able to catch my breath. I called my manager and told him everything that had happened. Then I contacted the county sheriff's department and reported the entire incident, from the man walking down the road to the truck blocking the exit and the movement inside the house. The deputy who answered asked several questions about the address and said they would send a patrol unit to check the property. About 2 hours later, he called me back. He said they had found the house locked with no signs of forced entry, and that the truck was no longer on the road when deputies arrived. I asked whether they had found the man I had seen walking, but the answer was no. They hadn't found anyone nearby either. The deputy said they would file an incident report even though there was no concrete evidence, because the situation involved a possible intentional road blockage. That was the end of the conversation, but the feeling that something was missing from the story never went away. A few days later, another real estate agent from my office took over that listing because I refused to go back. She visited the property in the morning with a contractor and didn't report anything unusual at all. The house was eventually sold a few months later, and I never heard of any problems involving the new owners. Even so, I still think about that afternoon every time I have to visit an isolated property. Since then, I've started telling coworkers the exact address of every appointment, sharing my live location, and avoiding vacant houses late in the day. Maybe it was all an unlikely coincidence. Maybe the truck really had broken down. The man was simply out for a walk and I misinterpreted the movement inside the house. I'd like to believe that, but I still remember the certainty I felt when I saw that curtain move from the inside only a few seconds after I had locked the door and left the house completely empty. And more than anything else, I've never been able to forget the image of that man standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave without showing the slightest surprise, as if he had known exactly what was going to happen all along. Story 3. My name is Daniel. I'm 36 years old and I live with my wife Emily in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her family lives in northern Arkansas, and a few times each year we make the drive to visit them over the weekend. We usually leave at night after I finish work because it helps us avoid traffic and lets us arrive early the next morning. This happened in September 2023. I had worked later than usual that day, so we didn't get on the road until around 10 at night. The forecast called for clear weather with no rain, and the trip was completely normal during the first few hours. We talked, listened to music at a low volume, and made our usual stops for gas and coffee. Around 1 in the morning, we were driving through a much more isolated part of rural Arkansas, where the towns are spread far apart. Since I had driven that route several times before, I wasn't concerned. The only difference was that the GPS suggested a short detour to avoid a section of road construction on the state highway. According to the app, it would save us about 20 minutes. At first, the route seemed perfectly normal. We turned onto a narrow paved road surrounded by farms and wooded areas. There were no streetlights, only our headlights illuminating the pavement and the reflective signs along the curves. As we continued, our cell signal began to disappear, and the music stopped loading. Emily even joked that it looked like something out of a movie, but neither of us was actually worried. The road remained in good condition, although it was obvious that very few people traveled there during the night. In nearly half an hour, we didn't pass a single vehicle coming the other way. We also didn't see any houses with lights on, gas stations, or any sign of activity. After a few more curves, our headlights illuminated an old wooden bridge crossing a narrow river. It was long, with low wooden guardrails darkened by age, and it made that unmistakable sound of planks vibrating beneath the weight of the car. I slowed down considerably before crossing because the structure looked far too old to inspire confidence. Even so, we kept going, never imagining that bridge would become the worst possible place for us to get trapped. As soon as we crossed the bridge, the road continued for another few hundred feet before disappearing behind a sharp curve. The moment we came around that bend, I immediately slammed on the brakes. A massive tree had fallen across the road. The trunk stretched from one side of the pavement to the other, and its branches reached all the way into the vegetation on both sides. It looked like it had fallen recently. There were still green leaves attached to the branches, and fresh pale wood was visible where the trunk had split. Emily asked if I thought it had fallen because of the wind, but that didn't make much sense either. The night was completely calm with no rain and barely any breeze. I got out and walked only a few steps toward it to see if we could remove some of the smaller branches, but as soon as I got closer, I realized it would be impossible. The trunk was far too thick for any attempt to move it. There wasn't enough room to drive around it either because the forest dropped off into steep embankments leading down to the river on both sides. I quickly returned to the car and told Emily there was no choice but to turn around and go back across the bridge. I backed up a few yards until I found enough room to maneuver. Since the road was so narrow, I had to move forward and backward several times before I could line the car up toward the bridge again. We crossed the wooden structure even more slowly than before. The sound of the planks creaking beneath the tires seemed much louder now that everything else around us was completely silent. Just as we were about to reach the opposite end, my headlights illuminated something that definitely hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. An old pickup truck was parked sideways across the entrance to the bridge. It blocked almost the entire opening between the trees. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to understand where it had come from so quickly. I was absolutely certain we hadn't passed another vehicle since entering that road. I stopped before leaving the bridge, expecting someone to get out and move the truck. But no one appeared. The engine seemed to be off, the headlights were dark, and the entire front of the vehicle remained completely black. Emily looked at me and quietly asked if it was blocking the exit on purpose. For the first time that night, I didn't have an answer. I sat there for several seconds with the engine still running, trying to decide what to do. The bridge was far too narrow to turn around, and there was a steep drop on both sides leading directly to the river. Making a U-turn there was impossible. My only option would have been to reverse all the way across the bridge back to the road on the other side, but that would also be incredibly difficult in the dark. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but it displayed only "no service." Emily tried hers and got exactly the same result. While we were trying to decide what to do, I noticed a faint light flashing among the trees on the right bank of the river. At first, I assumed it was just a reflection from our headlights. I blinked a few times, looked again, and realized the light was still there, slowly moving between the trees. A few seconds later, another light appeared on the opposite side of the river, then a third one. They were flashlights. They weren't especially bright, but they were strong enough to create small white circles among the vegetation. None of them remained still. They all moved slowly, as if people were carefully walking through the woods. The silence made everything even worse. We couldn't hear voices, engines, or footsteps. Only the river flowing beneath the bridge and, every now and then, the sound of dry branches snapping somewhere in the forest. Emily gripped my arm so tightly it actually hurt. She asked if they were police officers or maintenance workers, but I already knew that explanation didn't make sense. If someone were clearing the fallen tree, there would have been service trucks, work lights, or at least some kind of warning signs. Instead, the flashlights remained hidden among the trees, slowly moving closer to the bridge without ever shining directly onto the road. As I kept watching, I noticed something even stranger. The people carrying those lights seemed to be keeping a certain distance from one another, almost as if they were gradually surrounding the area. Meanwhile, the pickup truck remained completely still, blocking the only exit. That was when I noticed a faint glow coming from inside the cab. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out a face, only a dark silhouette sitting perfectly still behind the steering wheel, looking toward the bridge. At that moment, I stopped trying to figure out who those people were and focused only on getting the two of us out of there. I knew that if I waited another few minutes, those flashlights would be close enough to reach the bridge. I shifted into reverse and slowly began backing up. The wooden planks creaked beneath the tires, and I had to alternate between both side mirrors and the backup camera, which was almost useless in the darkness. Emily rolled down her window slightly to listen more carefully to what was happening outside. That's when we heard the first whistle. It was short and distant. A few seconds later, another whistle answered from the opposite side of the river. Neither of us said anything, but it was obvious those people were communicating with one another. I kept reversing as quickly as I safely could without risking driving off the bridge. Meanwhile, the flashlights appeared closer and closer among the trees. At one point, one of them briefly illuminated the side of the bridge, as if someone were checking our exact position. The silhouette inside the pickup truck remained completely motionless the entire time. When I finally reached the side of the road where the fallen tree blocked the way, I came up with an idea I normally never would have considered. There was a narrow strip of ground between the end of the bridge and the riverbank. It was tight, full of brush and rocks, but it seemed to continue along the shoreline for a short distance. It wasn't a road. It was probably just an access path used by fishermen or bridge maintenance crews. I looked at Emily and simply told her to hold on tight. I turned the steering wheel all the way and accelerated toward that strip of ground. The car dropped hard, scraping its undercarriage against hidden rocks. I thought we'd get stuck immediately, but the tires found enough traction to keep moving forward. Branches slammed against the doors and the sides of the car as we pushed ahead, barely able to see where we were going. After several extremely tense seconds, the makeshift trail rejoined the road a few hundred yards beyond the fallen tree. As soon as the car climbed back onto the pavement, I accelerated as fast as I could without looking back. It wasn't until we were already far away that Emily looked through the rear window and said she could see several flashlights gathered near the entrance to the bridge, all pointed toward the direction where we had disappeared. We drove for nearly 40 minutes without seeing another vehicle. When we finally reached a larger highway, we stopped at a 24-hour convenience store. As soon as I walked inside, I asked to use the phone because my cell phone still had no signal. I called the county sheriff's department and explained everything that had happened. The dispatcher asked questions about the approximate location of the bridge, the fallen tree, the pickup truck, and the flashlights in the woods. About half an hour later, a deputy met us at the gas station to take our report in person. He listened carefully and wrote down every detail. When I mentioned the freshly fallen tree blocking the road, he commented that county crews had not received any reports of fallen trees in that area that night. He also said he knew of several old bridges that were barely used anymore, and asked whether I could identify the exact location. Unfortunately, I couldn't, since we had simply followed the GPS and lost signal during most of the drive. I had no idea which rural road we had been on. The report was filed, but we never received any follow-up telling us whether they had found the pickup truck or the people in the woods. It's been almost 2 years since that trip, and Emily and I have completely changed our habits whenever we drive at night. We never follow GPS detours anymore without first checking whether the route stays on major highways. We also download offline maps and avoid driving on rural roads after dark, especially in places where we don't know anyone. Sometimes we still talk about that night, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the tree really had fallen by chance. Maybe the pickup truck belonged to a local resident. Maybe the flashlights belonged to hunters walking through the woods. Taken separately, each of those things could make sense. The problem is that they all happened at the exact same time, precisely when we were trapped on a narrow bridge with no way to escape. What I've never been able to forget is the feeling that those lights weren't simply moving through the forest. They seemed to be approaching the bridge in an organized way, while someone remained seated inside the pickup truck, silently waiting on the other side. Even now, whenever I cross an isolated bridge in the middle of the night, I remember that night and press the accelerator a little harder than I probably should. Story 4. My name is Lauren, I'm 22 years old, and at the time this happened I was in my senior year at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. My parents live near Nashville, so I usually made that drive at least once a month. I always preferred leaving early to avoid traffic, but that weekend one of my exams ended later than expected, and I didn't get on the road until mid-afternoon. The plan was to reach my parents' house before dark. My car was a Honda Civic that was already a few years old, but it had never given me any serious problems. The trip was going normally until, while driving through a rural part of the state, I started hearing a metallic noise coming from the front of the car. At first it sounded like nothing more than a vibration whenever I drove over uneven pavement. But a few miles later the noise became constant. I was afraid of continuing to drive and causing more serious damage, so I decided to find a place to check the problem before continuing my trip. A few minutes later, I found a small gas station that was almost empty. Only one pump was in use and an older man was filling up an old pickup truck. I asked the attendant if there was a repair shop nearby. He said there was one in the next town, but it would already be closed by that time of day. Before I could decide what to do, the man with the pickup overheard the conversation and mentioned that he knew a mechanic who worked late. According to him, the shop was located at the end of a rural road just a few minutes away. He gave me the directions very casually and assured me that the mechanic was well known in the area for helping stranded travelers. It sounded reasonable enough. The location barely showed up on my GPS, but I managed to find the road by following the directions he had given me. It was a narrow road lined with trees on both sides that ended at an isolated property. At the end stood an old metal garage, several car parts scattered around the yard, and a rusted sign indicating that it was indeed an auto repair shop. As soon as I parked, a man wearing mechanic's coveralls walked out of the garage smiling and asked what was wrong with my car, as if he had been expecting someone. I explained the noise coming from the front of the car and apologized for showing up so close to closing time. The mechanic was very polite. He said it probably wasn't anything serious, and that it would only take a few minutes to check. He looked to be in his early 50s, wore a heavily worn blue baseball cap, and spoke with that familiar rural Tennessee accent. That actually made me feel more at ease. I opened the hood and he began inspecting the engine compartment with a flashlight. Then he asked me to start the car, rev the engine a few times, and turn the steering wheel from side to side. After that, he said it would be better to put the car on the lift so he could inspect the suspension underneath. Without giving it much thought, I handed him the key. While he drove the car into the garage, I stayed outside looking around the property. Besides the garage, there was a small wooden office, a locked storage building, and several old cars parked around the yard. The place was quiet. There were no nearby houses, only woods stretching in almost every direction. Even then, I still believed I had simply been lucky to find someone willing to help. About 10 minutes later, I sat down on a wooden bench beside the office while waiting for the diagnosis. The mechanic was working underneath my car, and I could hear the sound of tools striking metal inside the garage. That's when I heard an engine approaching along the road. A pickup truck slowly pulled into the property and parked near the entrance. I assumed it was another customer. A few minutes later, a second pickup arrived. This time, instead of parking beside the first one, it stopped sideways across the entrance I had driven through. At first, I thought they might be unloading some heavy equipment, but I quickly realized that neither driver got out to work. Both of them remained near their trucks, talking quietly while occasionally glancing toward the garage. Without realizing it, I watched them for several minutes. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Together, the two pickup trucks completely blocked the only exit from the property. Even if I got my car back immediately, there wouldn't be enough room to drive between them. I tried not to jump to conclusions. I told myself they might simply be waiting for a delivery or chatting before leaving. Even so, I decided it would be better to get my car and continue my trip, regardless of the mechanical problem. I walked into the garage looking for the mechanic. The strong smell of burned oil, grease, and hot metal was much more intense inside. My car was still raised on the lift. The mechanic was lying on a creeper underneath it, working on something near the front wheel. I told him I would rather continue my trip and take the car to a larger repair shop the following morning. He slowly rolled out from under the car and replied with a calm smile that he only needed a few more minutes. I then asked him for my car key so I could at least wait inside the vehicle. At that moment, he frowned, reached into the pocket of his coveralls, and said he thought he had left the keys on the workbench. He walked over, moved some tools around, and started opening drawers. Then he looked at me and said in an oddly calm voice that they had disappeared. It made no sense. I had handed the key directly to him less than 20 minutes earlier. While he continued pretending to search, I heard pickup truck doors slam outside. Instinctively, I looked through the open garage door and saw that there were now 4 men spread across the property. None of them wore mechanics' uniforms. 2 were standing near the blocked entrance. Another was slowly walking toward the office, and the 4th remained beside my car, outside the lift, watching the inside of the garage. My heart immediately started racing. I asked for my key again, this time much more firmly. The mechanic simply replied that it would turn up. That's when I noticed something else. The side door of the garage, which I could have used to walk toward the back of the property, was now locked with a padlock that I was certain hadn't been there when I arrived. I quietly took a few steps backward while watching the men out of the corner of my eye. At that moment, 2 of them began slowly walking toward my car, positioning themselves on opposite sides of it as if they were simply waiting for me to make a move. At that point, I knew I could no longer pretend it was all just a misunderstanding. I forced a smile and told the mechanic I needed to grab my backpack from the car because my phone charger was inside. He simply replied, "Sure," but made no effort to return my key. Instead, he just watched me. I walked out of the garage trying to appear calm even though my legs were shaking. The 2 men standing near the car followed every step I took with their eyes. When I reached the vehicle, I noticed that the driver's window was still partially open. I immediately remembered leaving it cracked to ventilate the car because of the heat. Taking advantage of the fact that the men were still a few yards away, I slipped my arm through the opening and pressed the interior door unlock button. I managed to open the car, but the problem remained the same. Without the key, I wasn't going anywhere. I quickly grabbed my backpack and my phone, more out of instinct than because I had any real plan. Then I remembered a feature I almost never used. My car had a push-button start, and I always carried the electronic spare key in a small hidden pocket inside my backpack whenever I traveled long distances. My father had insisted years earlier that I do that in case I ever lost my main key. I had never needed it and usually forgot it was even there. I opened the compartment with trembling hands and felt an enormous wave of relief when I found the small key fob wrapped in plastic. I discreetly looked up and realized the men were no longer pretending to be uninterested. One of them started walking directly toward me. Another did the same from the opposite side of the car. Without thinking twice, I got into the driver's seat, immediately locked the doors, and pressed the start button. The engine came to life instantly. At that exact moment, I heard someone slam a hand against the passenger window. I shifted into reverse before any of them could get behind the car. The tires threw up dirt and gravel as I backed away quickly. The men started running, and the mechanic finally came out of the garage shouting something I couldn't understand. The only thing I could think about was getting off that property as fast as possible. The 2 pickup trucks were still blocking the entrance, but as I backed up, I realized one of them wasn't completely parked sideways. There was a very narrow gap between its front bumper and an old wooden fence that was already badly deteriorated. It was risky, but it looked like my only chance. I accelerated toward the opening. The right side of my car scraped hard against the fence, breaking several boards while my left mirror slammed into the side of the pickup truck. I heard the plastic crack, but I kept accelerating without slowing down. Behind me, one of the men made one last attempt to reach the driver's door, but he was left behind as the car picked up speed. I didn't look in the rearview mirror again until I was back on the main road. As soon as I got a cell signal, I called 911 while I was still driving. I explained where I was, described the property, the garage, the pickup trucks, and everything that had happened. The dispatcher instructed me not to return under any circumstances and told me to continue to the nearest town where an officer would meet me. The officers took my report that same night and returned with me to the entrance of the rural road. By the time we arrived, it was already after 9 o'clock. The garage was still there, but it was completely closed. There were no pickup trucks at the entrance, no car on the lift, and no one on the property. They knocked on the office door and called out several times, but nobody answered. Over the following days, an investigator contacted me to confirm a few details. He never told me whether they identified the mechanic or located the men who had been at the garage. I also never got my original keys back. Ever since then, I've never stopped at an unfamiliar repair shop recommended by someone I met on the road, especially when I'm traveling alone. I would much rather call roadside assistance, even if it means waiting for hours for a tow truck. Maybe it was all just an incredibly strange series of coincidences, but even now, when I remember the way those men began surrounding my car the moment they realized I no longer had my key, I still believe that if my father hadn't insisted I carry that spare key in my backpack, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. Story 5. My name is Ryan. I'm 33 years old and I work as a freelance nature photographer. A large part of my job involves traveling to state parks and national forests to photograph landscapes for magazines, stock image libraries, and tourism companies. I've always enjoyed staying in isolated cabins because it makes it much easier to head out before sunrise and capture the morning light. That was exactly why I rented a small cabin on the edge of the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee during the fall of 2023. The property looked perfect in the listing photos. It was simple, surrounded by dense woods and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that ended directly in front of the porch. There were no other cabins or houses nearby. The owner described it as the ideal place for anyone looking for peace, quiet, and isolation. Since I was traveling alone and only planned to spend 2 nights photographing the area, it seemed like exactly what I was looking for. I arrived at the cabin around 4 in the afternoon. The last few miles already gave me a good idea of just how isolated the area was. The dirt road became narrower and narrower as it wound through the forest. In some places, low branches scraped across the roof of my pickup truck. When I finally reached the end of the road, I found the cabin exactly as it had appeared in the photos. It was a small wooden building with a narrow front porch, an emergency generator beside it, and a gravel parking area where I left my truck. Beyond that, there was absolutely nothing else. The road simply ended in front of the property, and behind the cabin there was only dense forest. I spent the rest of the afternoon hiking a few nearby trails to scout the area and take some sunset photographs. I returned before dark, made myself a simple dinner, and transferred the photos from my camera to my laptop. The temperature dropped quickly after 7 that evening, so I locked all the doors, checked every window, and went to bed early because I planned to wake up before sunrise to photograph the morning fog drifting through the trees. I have no idea how long I had been asleep before I woke up. The first thing I heard was the sound of engines running outside. They were gasoline engines, low and rumbling, slowly approaching along the dirt road. I looked at the clock on the nightstand and saw that it was just after 1 in the morning. I lay there for a few seconds trying to figure out who could possibly be coming out there at that hour. The road ended at the cabin. There were no vehicle trails beyond it and no other properties. The engines came closer and closer until they finally stopped. One shut off first. A few seconds later, the other one went silent as well. The silence that followed was even stranger. I didn't immediately hear doors closing, voices or music, just the complete silence of the forest in the middle of the night. I slowly got out of bed without turning on any lights and walked to one of the living room windows. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see the entrance to the property. 2 vehicles were parked side by side exactly where the road ended. One looked like a dark pickup truck. The other was an older SUV. Both had their headlights turned off. I kept watching, expecting someone to get out and knock on the door, Maybe because they were lost. But that never happened. After almost a minute, the doors slowly opened. One man stepped out of the pickup truck, then another. Next, 2 more people got out of the SUV. None of them spoke. They weren't using flashlights either, although each one appeared to be carrying one in his hand. They simply closed the vehicle doors carefully and stood there for a few seconds looking toward the cabin. My heart immediately started racing. The first thought that crossed my mind was that they might be hunters, but that didn't make sense either. It was the middle of the night. They had no visible hunting gear and they were standing on private property. I remained perfectly still behind the curtain. A moment later, the men began walking slowly. Instead of heading together toward the porch, they spread out around the cabin, disappearing into the trees on both sides of the building. Since their flashlights remained off, I could only catch glimpses of them whenever they passed through patches of moonlight, before disappearing back into the darkness of the woods. At that moment, I tried to come up with an explanation that didn't involve the worst possible scenario. Maybe they were forest rangers searching for a missing person. Maybe the property owner had sent people to check something at the cabin. But the longer I watched, the less those explanations made sense. None of them wore any visible identification, and no one seemed interested in approaching the front door or calling out. They simply walked slowly around the cabin, always keeping a certain distance from one another, as if they were taking up specific positions. At times I completely lost sight of one of them, only to see his silhouette appear between the trees on the opposite side of the cabin a few seconds later. I stayed perfectly still, trying to make as little noise as possible. I even turned off my phone screen so that no light would escape through the windows. After several minutes, I decided I couldn't just wait. If there was still any chance of getting out of there, I needed to try before those men got any closer. I grabbed the keys to my pickup truck from the kitchen table and headed for the back door, because it was closer to where the truck was parked. I opened the door only a few inches and listened carefully. I heard no footsteps and no voices. Taking advantage of that moment, I ran to the truck as quietly as I could. I climbed inside, gently closed the door without slamming it, and immediately pressed the start button. Nothing happened. The dashboard didn't even light up. I tried again, thinking maybe I'd forgotten to press the brake because of my nerves. Once again, absolutely nothing. My first thought was that the battery had somehow died, but that was practically impossible. It had been replaced only a few months earlier, and I had driven normally all afternoon. I grabbed the small flashlight I always kept in the center console, opened the hood, and quickly shined the light into the engine compartment. It took only a few seconds for me to understand what had happened. Both main battery cables had been completely disconnected. They hadn't come loose on their own. The nuts had been carefully removed, and the terminals had been pulled away from the battery as if someone had used a tool to disconnect them. At that exact moment, I heard the sound of dry leaves being stepped on behind the truck. I froze where I stood, still holding the flashlight with its beam turned off, realizing that someone had approached while I was looking under the hood. I carefully lowered the hood without making any unnecessary noise and crouched beside the truck. My breathing was so fast that I was convinced anyone nearby could hear it. The footsteps stopped for several seconds. Then I heard another sound, this time coming from the opposite side of the cabin. It didn't sound like just one person moving. It was several small movements from different points in the woods, always slow, as if whoever was out there was deliberately trying not to make noise. I cautiously raised myself just a few inches above the side of the truck. In the faint moonlight, I could make out a man standing between 2 trees about 30 yards away. He was holding a flashlight but still hadn't turned it on. A few seconds later, another man appeared farther to the right. Then a third emerged near the front porch. None of them spoke. None of them signaled to one another. They simply stood there looking toward the property. I immediately ducked back down. At that moment, it became painfully clear that staying outside was far more dangerous than going back inside the cabin. I ran back through the rear door and locked it the moment I got inside. I turned off every light that was still on and desperately started thinking of some way to call for help. My phone still had no signal whatsoever. The cabin had an emergency radio installed in the kitchen, something the owner had mentioned in the listing for use in case of fires or accidents. I rushed over, turned it on, and repeatedly tried to make contact. The first 2 attempts brought nothing but static. On the third, a very distant voice responded through heavy interference. I couldn't understand everything because of the static, but I managed to give my name, the cabin's location, and repeatedly say that there were people surrounding the property. The person on the other end simply told me to stay locked inside and repeat my location. While I was doing that, I heard 3 slow knocks on the front door. They weren't loud bangs. They were soft, evenly spaced knocks, almost polite. Then everything went completely silent again. I slowly walked to one of the side windows and looked through a narrow gap in the curtain. A man was standing on the porch with his back to me, staring into the forest as if he were waiting for a signal coming from the trees. The next several minutes felt endless. I kept trying to communicate over the radio while watching the porch through tiny openings in the curtains. The man remained standing there for a while before slowly walking down the steps and disappearing into the darkness. I could still hear occasional movement around the cabin, branches snapping and dry leaves rustling, but no one knocked on the door again. About 20 minutes later, I heard a completely different sound. It was the engine of a heavy vehicle coming up the dirt road. A moment later, bright lights appeared through the trees. For the first time that night, I heard loud voices outside. Within seconds, engines started up, and I heard tires throwing gravel. I ran to another window and saw both vehicles speeding away from the property before the Forest Service truck even reached the cabin. Shortly afterward, 2 officers knocked on the door, identified themselves, and only then did I unlock it. They searched the entire area around the cabin and confirmed that they had indeed found the battery cables removed and lying beside the engine compartment. One of them commented that there was no way that could have happened by itself. The following morning, I accompanied the officers back to the main road to file an official report. They said they would search the area, but I never found out whether they located the vehicles or identified the men who had been at the property that night. The owner of the cabin was just as surprised as I was when I told him everything that had happened. According to him, nothing like that had ever occurred during the years he had rented the cabin to tourists and photographers. Since then, I still work as a nature photographer, but I've completely changed the way I travel. I never stay alone in isolated cabins that are accessible by only a single road anymore. I also check my vehicle before going to bed and always choose places where there's either cell service or at least a nearby neighbor. To this day, I still can't explain how someone managed to disconnect my battery cables while I was asleep without making any other noticeable noise. What bothers me the most isn't even remembering the men silently walking around the cabin. It's realizing they had enough time to tamper with my truck without me noticing a single thing while I slept. Completely convinced I was alone in the middle of the forest. Story 6. My name is Nathan, I'm 31 years old, and I work as a nurse at a small regional hospital in rural Montana. I live in a town about 50 minutes from the hospital, and I make that drive almost every day. Anyone who works 12-hour shifts knows what it's like to leave work completely exhausted, especially after a busy shift. This happened during the winter of 2024, on a night when the emergency room was overwhelmed with patients injured in accidents caused by the snow that had fallen earlier that afternoon. By the time I finally left the hospital, it was already past 11 at night. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep for a few hours before my next shift. The temperature was below freezing, and there was a thin layer of ice along the edges of the road. Even so, the sky was clear, and visibility was good. I turned on the heater, put on some quiet music, and headed down the highway I normally took home. After about 15 minutes on the road, I came across a series of orange signs indicating a temporary detour. One of them stated that the highway ahead was closed because of emergency roadwork. Reflective traffic cones directed all drivers onto a secondary gravel road. I didn't think much of it because overnight road construction is relatively common in that region during the winter. I followed the detour exactly as the signs instructed. For the first few miles, there were still cones and small reflective markers showing the way. Gradually, however, they began to disappear. I kept driving because the road continued in the same direction, and I assumed it would reconnect with the highway soon enough. The problem was that it never did. I drove for nearly 20 minutes without passing a single vehicle. I also didn't see any houses, farms with lights on, or construction equipment. There were only snow-covered fields, old fences, and the familiar darkness of rural Montana. Little by little, I started to feel that something about the route simply didn't make sense. After several more miles, the road became increasingly narrow. The gravel gave way to a stretch of dirt hardened by frost, and the tires made a dry, crunching sound over the frozen surface. I slowed down considerably because there were several potholes hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. I checked the GPS again, but the app seemed completely confused. My vehicle's icon remained frozen in a gray area of the map with no road name and no indication of how to get back to the highway. I considered turning around right there, but there wasn't enough room to maneuver. I kept going for a few more minutes, hoping to find an intersection. Instead, the road ended abruptly in front of a huge abandoned agricultural storage facility. It was an old metal warehouse, partially rusted, surrounded by empty silos and farming equipment covered with torn tarps. There wasn't the slightest sign of activity. There were no more traffic cones, orange signs, or any evidence of roadwork. I stopped the car and looked around, trying to understand how an official detour route could simply end in a place like that. The first thing I did was look in the rearview mirror to see whether I had somehow missed a turn. That's when I got the shock of my life. The road I had just driven down was completely empty. None of the reflective markers I had been following were visible behind me anymore. It was as if they had never existed. I got out of the car just long enough to shine my phone's flashlight down the road. There were only tire tracks in the snow and the darkness of the surrounding fields. I quickly got back inside and began turning the car around. As I shifted into reverse, I noticed two small dark shapes appear in the distance. A car was slowly driving toward me. At first, I actually felt relieved, assuming it was another lost driver. But as it approached the warehouse, it did something that completely changed that impression. The vehicle stopped just a few yards behind my car. Then its headlights were turned off. The engine kept running, but no one got out. The only thing I could see was the dark silhouette of the car sitting directly in the only exit from that dead-end road. I stared into the mirror for several long seconds, expecting the driver to simply turn around or roll down the window to ask for directions. Nothing happened. The car remained perfectly still with its headlights off and the engine idling. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call 911, but just like on other sections of that road, the screen displayed only "no service." As I held the phone near the windshield trying to find a signal, I heard a metallic sound coming from the warehouse. It was the unmistakable noise of a sliding door being slowly opened. I immediately turned my head toward it. A small side door on the warehouse, which I was certain had been closed when I arrived, was now partially open. A few seconds later, someone stepped outside and began walking slowly. It was a man wearing a heavy dark jacket and a baseball cap. He wasn't carrying any tools, nor did he seem surprised to see my car. He simply closed the door behind him and started walking straight toward me. At that moment, a very unsettling feeling came over me. Judging by the way he emerged from the warehouse and the position of the car behind me, it felt as though both of them knew exactly where I was going to end up. I looked back toward the road and noticed something else that made my blood run cold. The driver of the car still hadn't gotten out, but he had quietly opened the driver's door and now had one foot resting outside, as if he were simply waiting for the man from the warehouse to get closer. That's when everything suddenly clicked in my mind. The detour signs had disappeared. There had never been any road work. The road ended right at that isolated warehouse. For the first time, I seriously considered that someone might have set up a fake detour to lure tired drivers into that place. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't wait to confirm my suspicion. I turned the steering wheel all the way and accelerated toward a section of barbed wire fence separating the warehouse property from a snow-covered field. The front of my car smashed through the wooden fence posts with a violent impact. I heard the rear window shatter as one of the strands of wire scraped across the side of the car, but I kept accelerating without looking back. The car slid badly across the snow, but it continued moving through the open field, finally putting distance between me and the dead-end road. I drove across the field for several minutes without any real sense of direction. My only goal was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that warehouse. The car bounced so violently over the frozen snow that I thought the suspension was going to break. Eventually, I came across a service road used by local farmers and managed to get back onto pavement a few miles later. Shortly afterward, my cell signal finally returned. I pulled over onto the shoulder, still shaking, and immediately called 911. I explained where I worked, the route I had followed, the temporary detour signs, the abandoned warehouse, and the car that had blocked my exit. The dispatcher instructed me to stay on the line while a patrol unit was sent to a gas station in the nearest town, where officers would meet me. When I arrived, they photographed the damage to my car, especially the broken fence still caught on the front bumper and the deep scratches left by the barbed wire along the side. One of the officers commented that the damage helped confirm that I had indeed driven through private farmland to escape. The following day, an investigator contacted me to ask additional questions. He told me that officers had searched the area where I believed I had entered the fake detour, but they found no construction signs or reflective traffic cones. They also located the agricultural warehouse, which had indeed been abandoned for years. No one was there when they arrived. To this day, I don't know who put up those signs or whether anyone else had been led into the same situation before me. Ever since that night, I've never followed makeshift detours without first checking whether there's official information confirming that the road is actually closed. If I come across temporary signs on an otherwise deserted stretch of road, I'd rather turn around and find another route, even if it adds a significant amount of time to the trip. Maybe there's an explanation for everything that happened, but there's one image I've never been able to forget. That man calmly walking out of the abandoned warehouse at the exact moment a car pulled up behind me with its headlights turned off. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't end up there by accident. Someone was expecting the next lost driver to arrive at that exact place.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.